Another part, or another area that forms part of the crisis of legitimacy is the fact that communist states had massive security systems in place in the Eastern Bloc countries. Most famous is the Stasi, probably, in East Germany, but there was also the KGB in the Soviet Union, and the Securitate in Romania. But there were counterparts elsewhere. Now, the secret police, with their networks of informers, were part of this crisis of legitimacy, because if there's support for the system, why is it necessary for citizens to be monitored to such a large degree? So these security systems undermined a sense of comfort, there was no privacy, and it punished those who tried to make changes. Now, to highlight how vast the security systems were in the Eastern Bloc countries, I'll just mention, as we know from our World War II lectures, the Nazi regime in Germany enjoyed support amongst many elements of the German population. As a result, the secret police in Nazi Germany, the Gestapo, was actually a very small organization. They relied on support of the German population. They relied on denunciations, Germans denouncing each other. In East Germany, there wasn't the support for the system. So the Stasi was a huge network of informers, and they needed that. Now, this is by no means to suggest that, or to compare Nazi Germany with East Germany, or suggest that one system was in any way better or less repressive than the other. It's just to highlight the fact that the Eastern Bloc countries needed such a huge repressive tool because of the lack of support for the system. Okay, another long-term factor that we need to consider is the international system. International events and tensions added other pressures to the situation. The Cold War itself was very destabilizing, not least of which because it cost a lot. To keep up a militarized state was incredibly expensive. Think about it, the expenditures on arms, propaganda, international interventions. Now, in the 1980s, the US grew wealthier, so it was willing to devote more resources, more money to sort of display its power and superiority militarily. The Soviet Union, however, found it increasingly living beyond its means, as it tried to sort of even just keep up a facade of being on the same level militarily as the US. You add interventions to this mix, for instance, the Soviet war in Afghanistan was a disastrous war, and it lasted from 1979 to 1988. This led to an even shakier situation. The war in Afghanistan was very costly in terms of Soviet and Afghani lives, but also in terms of money. And it also led to protests and grumbling and a loss of prestige within the Soviet Union. Soldiers' families heard about the atrocities committed in the war, so there was a sense of anger and dissatisfaction. Now, events within Western Europe were also important in sort of nudging forward the collapse of communism. Greece and Portugal both transitioned to democracy in 1974. After the Spanish Civil War, Franco was the uncontested leader in Spain, but after his death in 1975, the country was able to transition to democracy. Keeping up with the theme that European history is world history, there was also a wave of democratization in Latin America in the 1980s. And all of this affected the Eastern Bloc. Because the old argument that communism was an alternative to these bloody, repressive, right-wing dictatorships didn't hold water after these systems collapsed. So communism sort of lost the high moral ground. It wasn't in contrast to anything anymore. In addition, in the 1970s, late 70s, early 1980s, the US, Britain, and West Germany elected conservative governments. So you had Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and Helmut Kohl in West Germany. So these conservative regimes, they sort of increased the tensions in the Cold War, but they also stepped up the anti-communist rhetoric and encouraged the exposure of abuses. Ronald Reagan famously said in 1987, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." Now also important was the bloody crackdown in China on pro-democracy protesters, most of them students, calls for reform at Tiananmen Square, Beijing in May 1989. This is just another example of how European and world history are intertwined. Now this event sent a chill through the European Eastern Bloc countries, but it also served as kind of a reminder for those regimes of what a high-cost repression on this scale could exact in international and domestic credibility. So, moving on now to key personalities. There are a number of individuals who played various roles in the collapse of communism. Given our time, I'm only going to highlight a few, starting with Pope John Paul II. Now, when he became Pope in 1978, he was actually the first non-Italian Pope in centuries, and the first Polish Pope ever. Pope John Paul II had been a young man during World War II, and he was educated in underground illegal seminaries. Of course, we discussed during the lecture on World War II that the Polish underground was very well developed. There were underground universities and schools, and Pope John Paul II was a product of this system. He was also a very noted anti-communist. He made 3 very, very important trips to Poland, communist Poland. One in 1983, during the period of martial law. And there he served as a symbol of the possibility of an anti-communist Poland. So he encouraged the Solidarity movement. He emboldened Catholics to take a stand against communism. And he was actually a highly visible figure in the entire world. But he strengthened people's will in Poland more than anywhere else to defiance. Now, dissidents came from within the USSR as well. Now, we've talked about Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He helped raise awareness internationally of the Soviet Union's Gulag system. His writings were often suppressed within the Soviet Union, itself, but he wrote many books that were available in the West. Notable among them are the Gulag Archipelago and One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Now, Solzhenitsyn was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970, but he was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1974. He wasn't able to return to Russia until 1994, after the Soviet Union had dissolved. There was also Andrei Sakharov, who was another Nobel Prize winner, but he was a physicist and a human rights activist, and he became a very prominent dissident in the world. He was liberated from house arrest in 1986 under Gorbachev to lead the democratic opposition in the USSR. Now, it wasn't just key, prominent individuals that featured in terms of dissidents. Many individuals, ordinary individuals, organized small grassroots organizations. These might be around sort of smaller issues. Women's rights, gay rights, environmental activism, religious issues, calls for peace, and end to the Cold War. Others worked underground for years, perhaps from prison, maybe from exile in the West. They wrote materials, pamphlets and whatnot were circulated, and people met to talk and consider the alternatives to the current system. This provided a core group of people that would become important when the anti-regime demonstrations really began to sort of gain momentum in 1989. So there were actually spokespeople on hand who could stand up and protest and demand the rights that they wanted. Another very important individual was Václav Havel, and he became the symbol of post-communist Czechoslovakia. He also became its first president and later presided over the peaceful separation of Czechoslovakia into the two countries of the Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1993. Now, he was a playwright and a dissident. He began writing satirical plays in the 1950s, but his works were banned in 1968 after the Prague Spring. And he too spent years in prison or under detention, house arrest. In the 1970s, he was a central figure in the Charter 77 movement, which lobbied to expose human rights violations, corruptions, and lies of the Czech communist government. Now, Havel tried to bring many of his themes from his literary works into political life. Hope, the importance of individual responsibility, freedom, the importance to live in truth, and really tried to bring a moral voice to politics. He played, perhaps, the key role to end communism in Czechoslovakia. Now, the turn to political commitment in Czechoslovakia was very sudden, but at the same time, it was so non-violent that it was termed the Velvet Revolution. It began after news of the fall of the Berlin Wall. The number of determined sort of protesters or dissidents grew dramatically. There were student demonstrations and petitions calling for reform. Crowds poured into the streets every single day, waving national flags. Eventually, there was calls for freedom of speech, the release of political prisoners, an end of communism, demand of the formation of a new government, and finally, on December 10th, 1989, the first cabinet in Czechoslovakia since 1948, not dominated by the communists, was sworn in. In a 1990 speech, Havel speaks to some of his themes, in particular, the notion of individual responsibility. He states, "We have all become used to the totalitarian system and accepted it as an unchangeable fact, and thus helped to perpetrate it. In other words, we were all, though naturally to different extents, responsible for the operation of the totalitarian machinery. None of us is just its victim. We are all its co-creators. If we accept this, we will understand that it is up to all of us and up to us alone to do something about it." Now, we have to speak about the individual who's perhaps the most crucial, and that was Mikhail Gorbachev. He came to prominence in 1985 as General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Now, make no mistake, he too was a communist, but he replaced a series of really old, hardline general secretaries, just Brezhnev. Now, Gorbachev was very shocked by the corruption and the mismanagement, the inefficiency of the system. He tried to use his position to normalize international relations, to particularly improve relations with the West, and to begin some sort of domestic internal reforms. So he introduced domestic reforms under two slogans: perestroika, which meant restructuring, and glasnost, which meant openness. Now, Gorbachev's reforms really blew the lid off of the Soviet system and off of Soviet society because it allowed people to express opinions about topics that had been previously forbidden. This was all without fear of reprisal. And as a result, he achieved enormous popularity abroad in the West and also in the Eastern Bloc countries. Inside the USSR, he wasn't as popular. There were many people who were vested in this system who had sort of an interest in the continuation of the system as it was. And also, any changes are disorienting and unsettling. No matter how necessary they may be, they're not always experienced positively by all elements of society. Economic restructuring that began under Gorbachev benefited some a lot more than others. We see this actually after Gorbachev leaves power in the 1990s, in the sort of wild years when the oligarchs really became prominent in Russia. But the important thing was, despite the frustration, glasnost meant that one could write about this. It allowed the extent of the problems to be revealed, created the possibility of change, but in and of itself, it was still destabilizing. Because the exposure of lies that people had been fed led to extreme bitterness. Extremely significant was Gorbachev's reversal of a policy of military intervention. Of course, this had led to repressions of the Hungarian Revolution, the Prague Spring in '68. Now, he pledged that he would not interfere in the affairs of others. This is stated openly in his speech in July 1989. Quote, any interference in domestic affairs and any attempts to restrict the sovereignty of states, both friends and allies, or any others, are inadmissible. Now, this proclamation, if you think about it, the date, came 2 months after Tiananmen Square, and it was a really important factor in emboldening people to start to take steps to transform their regime. There is a saying or a quip that the collapse of communism took 10 years in Poland, 10 months in Hungary, 10 days in Czechoslovakia, and 10 hours in Romania. Of course, we've talked about some of the complex processes, so this is a simplification, but there's an element of truth, and it helps us to sort of organize events that happen very rapidly. Because revolution was, in a sense, contagious, and there was a sense of euphoria at seeing these regimes collapse like a house of cards, and so there was momentum. I'm going to do a really quick sketch. Solidarity in Poland continued under the military dictatorship until 1988. At that stage, public pressure forced the government to appoint a civilian government. In January 1989, Solidarity was finally legalized again. In April, the Communist Party gave up the monopoly of power, and Poland had achieved full independence with Walesa as its first president in 1990. In the summer of 1989, Hungary opened its border to Austria. Of course, we had Gorbachev's announcement that he would not intervene. This led to an exodus of Hungarians and actually East Germans. There were demonstrations in East Germany in the fall and summer of that year. On October 18, 1989, the head of the East German government, Honecker, is forced by his party to resign because he's unwilling to implement anything more than cosmetic changes. On November 9, 1989, the East German government capitulated to the inevitable and announced sweeping changes. And they promised to initiate legislation that would grant Eastern Germans the right to travel wherever they wanted. So travel bans were lifted. This led to the fall of the wall. Now, the promise to hold free elections didn't keep the communists in power in East Germany. The government fell, and in the March elections of 1990, the party favoring German reunification won. The Velvet Revolution of Czechoslovakia in December 1989, and then the Soviet Union allowed other political parties in 1990. There were independence movements in the Baltic states. Central Asia Republic, Republic of Ukraine, Moldova, and left the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was declared dissolved in 1991. Now, we've just got 1 minute left, and I want to emphasize that really the momentum for change came from within the system. It wasn't the West, wasn't Reagan's call to tear down the wall. The regimes tried very hard to hold on to power, but they couldn't stop the momentum. On Thursday, we're going to talk about the collapse of communism in Romania, a country that didn't have a strong reform movement, and also in Yugoslavia, moving into the Balkan Wars. Have a great afternoon.